there, I'm Lloyd Evans, and in today's video I'm going to be returning to my hate speech dossier that was prepared by my former religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, in attempting to frame me as a hate speech enthusiast. If you don't know what I'm talking about, if you've not watched any of the previous hate speech episodes, it might be worth going back and learning more about this, because it's quite a big story. I won't be repeating myself. Suffice to say, there was a letter sent by Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses on February 4th, 2020, to Professor Alexis J. at the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, for which I am a core participant. So I am involved in giving evidence to the inquiry, which will be publishing its findings, by the way, hopefully around summertime. We don't know yet. But anyway, Christian Congregation of Jehovah's Witnesses sent this letter dated February 4th, 2020, branding me a hate speech enthusiast. Anyone who watches my channel, or indeed knows anything about me, knows that number one, I am not a hateful person, and number two, I'm certainly not prone to hate speech. Anyway, Jehovah's Witnesses want iicsa, or wanted iicsa, to think otherwise, so they prepared a 9-page dossier of examples of quotes where they claim I have exhibited this hate speech. In the previous episodes of this series, I've been going through this dossier. We're now on, out of 9 pages, page 6. In this video, I'll be going through pages 6 and 7, which are under the heading Minimizing Other Gross Acts of State Persecution. Now, when it says other gross acts of state persecution, I think it's referring back to part 1, which was titled Statements Downplaying the Holocaust and Other Acts of Persecution. So they accused me of downplaying the Holocaust, which totally didn't happen. I was actually just fact-checking a governing body member's summation of the number of Jehovah's Witness victims of the Holocaust, because he exaggerated it. So when it says other gross acts of state persecution, and they've already referred to Russia in previous examples, but it seems this section is to focus on Russia. Russia is where Jehovah's Witnesses are currently banned. There have been examples of terrible treatment of Jehovah's Witnesses by the Russian authorities, including reports of torture. I have consistently spoken out, even before the ban, against the ban and against any acts of brutality by the Russian authorities against members of my former religion. I've even been on BBC World Service Radio speaking against the ban, which we're going to see later because it's relevant to the material we're discussing. But my former religion was so desperate, it seems, to frame me as a hate speech enthusiast that they took the videos where I'm commenting on their use of the ban and the persecution for propaganda value. And they even use a video which I specifically made to denounce the mistreatment of Jehovah's Witnesses and try to somehow spin that to make it look like I'm in favor of it. You're going to see what I mean, but let's get underway, shall we? Let's take a look at example 1.
I was imprisoned for 1 year and 3 months for upholding Christian neutrality.
I was in a cell with all types of hardened criminals.
I was sitting at home. My whole family had been arrested.
They burnt down the villages. We had to go live in the bush. That was difficult because we had a baby.
And the police came in with guns and pointed them at us and handcuffed us, searched all our house, took everything away and took us to the detention centre. And that was the beginning of our imprisonment.
I was taken to prison all alone, scared, but I trusted in Jehovah that only He could protect me.
During that entire time, what helped me was the thought that Jehovah God would strengthen me, that He was by my side.
Every day, I would review all those scriptures in my mind and go over them. That was the first thing I did in the day. So never in any time, although I didn't have a Bible, did I feel any spiritual loss or weakness.
During the difficult moments with the baby, we always prayed to Jehovah. I saw Jehovah as my father, as a real person.
It was like I was hearing Jehovah's voice saying to me, "My daughter, don't worry, I am with you." So I never shrank back. I remained firm.
More testimonies of people who have been persecuted by their respective governments or regimes in the countries in which they live, and who are actually saying, look, they persecuted us, they came for us, they oppressed us, they burnt down our homes, they put us in jail cells, they did all these awful things, but we still kept faithful. And bearing that in mind, you have to ask, what good can possibly come from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses? What will be achieved by doing that? In the example of Russia, I've heard some people argue, oh yes, well if you ban the organisation, people are just going to forget basically that they're Jehovah's Witnesses. They're just going to, I'm now awake. I can be free from this religion now that it's banned. Well, watch those testimonies again. It just simply doesn't work that way. What you do when you persecute a religious minority, particularly one like Jehovah's Witnesses, is you feed into their narrative. You basically validate their theology, because their theology says that the Satan system will oppress them and will come after them. There isn't really a plus side. You can argue about property being seized and this having an impact on the organisation financially. I would argue that the propaganda value of witnesses being oppressed and persecuted outweighs any financial hit that the organisation takes because a few buildings have been impounded. Watchtower needs these stories and needs these narratives for its theology to make sense. So you judge for yourselves, I guess, whether there was any hate speech there. I think I've made a perfectly sound and valid point, which is that there's never a justifiable reason for persecuting religious minorities. And actually, when you do persecute fundamentalist groups like Jehovah's Witnesses, you're giving them an endless bounty of stories and anecdotes that can be used to strengthen the resolve of existing members and recruit new members. Am I the only one who missed the part where I said, what good can possibly come from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses? Let's play that again. What good can possibly come from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses? I've literally said in this clip, and they interestingly missed this out of the material that they're quoting, I've literally said, what good can possibly come from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses? And I wasn't asking that question in such a way as to say, well, there's this good and there's this good and there's this. It was clearly speaking against the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. But what's this document titled? Minimizing other gross acts of state persecution. I'm minimizing persecution, apparently. or I'm somehow in favor of it. But there you have me saying, as clear as day, what good can possibly come from persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses. There is a footnote for this example of hate speech. This is grossly offensive and minimizes the severe persecution Jehovah's Witnesses are facing in Russia. On 20th of April 2017, the Supreme Court of Russia banned Jehovah's Witnesses countrywide and ordered the state seizure of all of their consecrated places of worship. No other religious community has faced a similar nationwide ban. As in the Soviet era, it is now a criminal act for Jehovah's Witnesses to meet for worship, read their religious literature, or in any other way practice their faith. All things I have consistently spoken against. As of 31st of January 2020, more than 305 Jehovah's Witnesses have been charged under Article 282.2 brackets 1 and or 282.2 brackets 2 of the Criminal Code, which carries a sentence of up to 10 years imprisonment. Dozens are being held in pre-trial detention. There have been more than 811 separate police raids on the homes of Jehovah's Witnesses. See jwrussia.org. The United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention has concluded that Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia are the victims of systemic and institutionalized persecution, as has the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe. I don't disagree with any of that. I don't contradict any of that. I don't minimize any of that. The point I've made, or the point that they're trying to twist, is the perfectly valid observation that Jehovah's Witnesses are exploiting the treatment of individual Jehovah's Witnesses for propaganda value. And that's a valid observation. You have at least 2 music videos have been released so far where presumably Bethelites are pretending to get arrested or pretending to be roughed up by the police and thrown into jail cells. It's not enough to show the real stories and show the video footage of, say, Dennis Christensen being arrested and all that kind of thing. They're actually creating or enacting fake scenarios based on these stories for the purpose of essentially entertainment, for music videos. I even did a video thumbnail here talking about how there's an exhibit there was an exhibit in the Brazil branch office where witnesses could pose for photo opportunities in a mocked-up jail cell. So I'm not exaggerating here. It's a valid observation. This religion has a persecution complex, and it's exploiting stories of persecution, terrible as they are, for propaganda value. This isn't in any way to condone the persecution. I can be against the persecution and simultaneously against the way the persecution is being essentially milked by the organization. Anyway, I'll have more to say on this. Let's go to our next example.
Against us is the world's hatred. From all 3 parts of the world, commercial, religious, political, we feel the world's hatred. Now just consider the political element for a moment. As of last month, Jehovah's Witnesses are imprisoned for their faith in Eritrea, Russia, Singapore, South Korea, and Turkmenistan. Recently, 2 elderly witnesses in Eritrea died after suffering nearly a decade of inhumane treatment in prison. In Russia, police are aggressively raiding witness families, arresting them, interrogating them, charging them. With what objective? One of the officers said to one of the witnesses, "We are ridding the earth of you." These political elements hate us.
It seems we are concluding this convention on this, the last talk on the last day, just as we began the convention on Friday. Everything is about this siege mentality, this persecution complex, and Watchtower reveling in the fact that there are certain governmental regimes that are against Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, not just Jehovah's Witnesses, as it turns out, especially in the case of Russia, but other fringe groups that the authorities find it difficult to control because Jehovah's Witnesses are neutral politically and take their orders from New York. You can understand why something like that would get on the nerves of a leader like Putin. But oh no, that's not the reason. The reason why witnesses are being persecuted is because we're God's one true people. And this police officer even has the gall to say, "We're going to wipe you people out." Watchtower knows exactly what buttons to press to get witnesses excited and to give them this feeling of doom and convince them that these are the last days because we're being persecuted. So what we're seeing here is another example of me communicating a perfectly valid criticism without in any way endorsing the persecution of a religious minority. Maybe it's just me, viewers. Maybe I'm missing something obvious here. But it's the exploitation of the persecution that I am against. And I feel I've expressed those thoughts fairly clearly. I mean, whenever there's an example like these that we're looking at of Jehovah's Witness materials focusing on persecution, they never really explore what's causing the persecution, do they? They never talk about the underlying religious bigotry, or in this case, I talk about the political element of Vladimir Putin hating the fact that he can't control a group like Jehovah's Witnesses, which he can't. I mean, he can control other religious elements, other religious denominations in that country fairly easily, I would assume. He's never going to be able to bully his way into controlling the leaders of Jehovah's Witnesses and, for example, getting them to send him money. That's just not going to fly. The governing body have utter control over the local leadership in Russia, and I think that is what is mostly causing this treatment, this gross mistreatment of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia. But you're never going to get material like this is a convention talk, but I was mentioning earlier about music videos, for example, or let's say emotional testimonials, because Jehovah's Witnesses are going to argue, oh yeah, well, we should be able to remember and honor and pay tribute to victims of religious bigotry and religious intolerance. I agree, you should. But you're not just doing that, are you? You're not exploring the reasons behind the persecution. You're not showing examples of other religious minorities that are being persecuted and condemning that, are you? You're purely talking about this persecution from the standpoint of how could any other group be God's one true religion, because look how unique we are in being persecuted. That's the way it's always presented. Look at what faith these victims of persecution have. In what other religion could you see faith like this? Didn't Jesus say, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you also? The fact that we're being persecuted, as we're showing in these dramatizations and reenactments and testimonials and music videos, shows beyond a doubt that we are the ones that Jesus was referring to. We're God's one and only true organization. That's what I mean when I say persecution porn and exploiting persecution for propaganda value. They're not interested in stopping this. There's never any consideration for how do we fix this? How do we pressure governments to stop persecuting all religious minorities? What can individual Jehovah's Witnesses do in terms of writing to their MPs and stopping not just the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses, but the persecution of other religious minorities? What are we going to do about the Uyghurs in China? What are we going to do about the Rohingyas? What are we going to do about the Yazidis? They're not interested at all in any other religious persecution. They're only interested in their own. And that's why I don't buy this excuse of, oh, well, we should be able to pay tribute to these brave victims of persecution. I think we can all see very clearly from just the examples we've looked at so far that this isn't about denouncing or ending religious persecution. This is about exploiting it. But we're going to look at our next example. I really need to talk about this article in the Moscow Times. It's just gone up 3 hours ago as of filming, titled 7 Jehovah's Witnesses Brutally Tortured in Russia, spokesman says. It's just a heart-wrenching article. And, well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my thoughts on the Russian ban and what I've said before. But let me first of all read this article to you. It's only a brief article. A spokesman for the Jehovah's Witnesses has said that Russian investigators have brutally tortured adherents of the group who are currently held in detention. Russia's Supreme Court declared the Jehovah's Witnesses an extremist organization in 2017, leading to mass raids and causing hundreds of its estimated 175,000 members to flee the country. Earlier this month, a court in the city of Oriol convicted Dennis Christensen, a Danish Jehovah's Witness, of extremism and sentenced him to 6 years behind bars in a case that rights groups warned may trigger a crackdown on religious minorities. A spokesperson for the Jehovah's Witnesses said Tuesday that investigators in the Siberian city of Surgut had stripped, suffocated, doused with water and applied stun guns on at least 7 believers detained on extremism charges, days after criminal cases were reportedly initiated against 19 Jehovah's Witnesses following mass raids. The agents stripped the men naked, put a bag over each suspect's head and wrapped it with tape. Agents then tied each suspect's hands behind his back, smashed his fingers, and beat him on his neck, feet, and kidney. Jared Lopez, a spokesman for Jehovah's Witnesses at their world headquarters in New York, told the Moscow Times by email Tuesday. I cannot express just how appalled I am at this report. I think that this is disgraceful and deplorable thuggery by the Russian authorities. And if you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness, you may be confused at this point. What's this guy who's an ex-witness who runs an apostate channel? Why is he condemning this? I condemned it before the ban. I actually was on BBC World Service Radio and I was asked about my thoughts. This is what I said.
You're very welcome to the programme, Lloyd. Well, let me start with the idea of banning the group in Russia as the Russian government wants to do. What's your thoughts on it?
Hello, Nuala. I think it's a terrible idea. There are 3 main reasons why I'm opposed to the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses. first reason is human rights, fairly obviously. Everyone should be free to believe according to their conscience. The second reason is persecution complex. I think that with Jehovah's Witnesses, a lot of the teachings and beliefs are oriented around the Satan's world coming after them, and this sort of action by the Russian authorities really kind of bolsters that kind of fear and paranoia. And the third reason is that, you know, by banning Jehovah's Witnesses, you're driving the organisation underground, and that makes a lot of the more darker, more abusive practices harder to regulate.
You're in an interesting position in our last minute, Lloyd, because you still believe they should have that freedom of religion to practice wherever in the world.
Precisely. My father may be shunning us, but the last thing I would want to see is him thrown into a jail cell, and the same extends to Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia.
Very interesting. Different take on that story. Lloyd Evans, former Jehovah's Witness, also author of The Reluctant Apostate.
I also made a video titled The Day After the Ban, which I put out shortly before the ban was introduced, explaining in detail my reasons for condemning it. Put simply, no matter how much I dislike the organisation, and dislike is putting it mildly, no matter how much contempt I have for the abusive policies and practices of the Jehovah's Witness organisation, we must always differentiate between the leadership and those being led. Jehovah's Witnesses I view as victims already, because they have their lives devoted to something that is ultimately unfactual, illogical, and ultimately it can be abusive depending on the circumstances. So they're already victims. People who are victims need support, sympathy, understanding, resources to help them get through these issues. And instead of providing those things, the Russian government is rounding these people up and, best case scenario, incarcerating them, as has happened with Dennis Christensen, and we don't know what's happening to him in a Russian jail, by the way. And worst case scenario, these people are being outrageously tortured. Nobody ever deserves to be tortured just because of what's going on in their heads. And when I first spoke out against this ban, I received a lot of abuse from other ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who accused me of being, among other things, an apologist. And they seem to think that Putin had a handle on this. Putin knows what he's doing. He knows how to deal with cults. Well, this is the wisdom of Putin that we're seeing right here. This is what the Russian regime is capable of, and always has been capable of. We knew they were doing this already in the case of homosexuals in Russia, or at least in parts of Russia. So this should come as no surprise, but I still feel utterly gutted to hear of this. I feel that Jehovah's Witnesses are in need of support and resources to help them get their critical thinking skills up and running, and we simply do not persuade people in that situation by clamouring for this sort of thing, by cheerleading for this sort of brutality. We need to take a stand, I believe, as ex-witnesses, and say, no, it's the leadership we have an issue with. And make no mistake, in this particular scenario, as I said in the Day After the Ban video, this plays directly into the governing body's hands. I mean, seriously, if you are Stephen Lett, Tony Morris, Mark Sanderson, Jeffrey Jackson, I think it's unreasonable to say they're rubbing their hands, but this is furnishing those men with decades worth of persecution porn, as I've called it in the past. There will be videos made that talk about this, reenacting some elements of the torture. And these videos will be used to bring more people into the organisation. So I realise I've spoken about this a number of times, but it's just one of those times in your life where you think, no, something needs to be said about this. I do not want to be, I don't want anyone who watches my channel or who stumbles on my channel who might be a Jehovah's Witness just assuming that I'm okay with this just because I'm an ex-witness. I want to make it very clear that I utterly condemn this torture in the strongest possible terms. And if it were in my power to prevent it, if I were there at the time, I'd be doing everything I can to stop it. We need to be better than this. We need to find ways of tackling cults and tackling destructive mind control groups that do not involve punishing the victims. What do you even say about that? I literally made that video to condemn the torture and mistreatment of Jehovah's Witnesses as an ex-Jehovah's Witness, and they have the gall to include material from this video in a document framing me as a hate speech enthusiast under the heading minimizing other gross acts of state persecution. Apparently, I minimized the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in what we've just seen. Again, you'll have to reach your own conclusions, I guess, but let's just recap. I reacted to the article, and I can remember, by the way, where my head was at when I made this video. It wasn't so long ago. It was February 2019. I jumped on this article and thought, no, something needs to be said about this. There needs to be a strong condemnation of this story from the ex-Jehovah's Witness community, and I'm going to do it. And you can probably tell in my voice that I'm quite shaken. And I was shaken because I was imagining me being tortured. It could have been me in a different time, and if I'd been born in a different country, that could have been me. And that's where I was coming at this from just a place of total empathy and compassion, trying to put myself in the shoes of these witnesses who were reportedly tortured. I describe the article as heart-wrenching. I say I cannot express enough how appalled I am. I describe it as disgraceful and deplorable thuggery. I say these people are being outrageously tortured. Nobody ever deserves to be tortured just because of what's going on in their heads. I say I'm utterly gutted. And I say I utterly condemn this torture in the strongest possible terms. If it were in my power to prevent it, if I were there at the time, I'd be doing everything I can to stop it. I ask you, viewers, how can I be more emphatic in my position? The whole nature of the video is literally to condemn the torture of Jehovah's Witnesses. And they zero in on a part where I say this plays into the governing body's hands, which it does for the reasons I've explained here and elsewhere. Because whenever they touch on the persecution in their materials, in their propaganda, it's never solution-oriented. It's never, what are we going to do as a society about this? It's only ever, isn't this proof that we're God's one and only true organisation? I think out of all of the examples in the 9-page dossier, that's one of the most outrageous. Every video in this series, I get comments from people saying, can something not be done about this? Well, CCJW have protected status as core participants to the inquiry meaning that they can't be sued for libel. They could effectively say almost anything about me, regardless of how truthful it is, and I can't sue them for libel so long as it's part of the iicsa process, which this is. As frustrating as that is, it also works both ways. It means that they can't sue me for libel for things that I've said or for evidence I've given before iicsa. And knowing how litigious this organisation is, I'm actually kind of pleased about that. That said, there are potential avenues that we can explore, we being me and my lawyer, because we believe there were lines crossed here, above and beyond defamation and trying to besmirch someone's character. This is quite clearly an example of a legal process being misled. So I can't really say too much more other than that, other than to say, if there is something I can do about this, you can bet your bottom dollar I'll try and do it. Anyway, next example.
The last time government officials came to our place, they took us to their office for questioning. They said they had no choice, and we went in their car. At that moment, I felt that Jehovah was not only giving me his Holy Spirit and wisdom, but also giving me the physical strength to go. I was so thankful to him.
Indeed, on that day when we were taken in the car, I prayed to Jehovah. Please help us to be able to give a witness about you.
A government official even said these words: "It's very interesting for us to talk with you. When we talk with people of other faiths, we never have our questions fully answered. But you know the correct answers to our questions and are capable of giving them."
Isaiah 31:5 is a big help, because there, Jehovah is described as being like swooping birds. After all, Jehovah is above me. In this verse, he also promises that he will defend and save.
So what we have here is yet more persecution porn. They are literally reenacting someone's story of being persecuted by the police. And this will have required, of course, Jehovah's Witnesses to dress up as police and get that car all looking as though it's a police car with the lights and everything, and show them banging on the door and leading these fellow Jehovah's Witnesses away. This shows perfectly how Watchtower leaps on persecution and craves it, in fact, in order for its theology to make sense.
So almost every day, unfriendly neighbors stopped us and continued to say to us, "Stop your work, go out from our village." In those moments, I just used to pray silently to Jehovah.
I was a bit afraid, since I had still fresh in my mind all the memory, the difficulties, and how the neighbors threw the stones at us. But the words in Isaiah 41 verse 10 gave me strength. "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Do not be anxious, for I am your God. I will fortify you. I will really hold on to you with my right hand." Reading these words always gave us power to continue our service.
I've obviously spoken at length on my channel about how opposed I am to persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses and to governmental bans against Jehovah's Witnesses, so I don't feel there's any need to go over all of the reasoning all over again, apart from saying that what I've said in the previous video for the Friday of the convention, that apart from anything else, banning and persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses doesn't stop them being Jehovah's Witnesses. Here you have a couple who are building a kingdom hall, the kingdom hall gets burned down, they build it again, it gets burned down, they build it again. You do not stop people from being in a cult just by opposing them, just by banning that cult, just by persecuting them and abusing them. This story just highlights for me that apart from that kind of behaviour being cruel and abhorrent and in violation of people's right to believe what they want, ultimately it just doesn't achieve its aims.
10 days passed, and then I was released. They gave me my bag and said, "You're free now." When they were releasing me, one guard asked me to give him a magazine. I felt joy that even the situation I found myself in served for spreading the good news.
I sometimes feel guilty when I say Jehovah's Witnesses love being persecuted, because it isn't quite as simple as that. Obviously, when you're being persecuted, it's not a nice thing, and I can understand Jehovah's Witnesses watching thinking, well, that's not true at all. We hate persecution. But then you watch a video like this, where Nikolai is recounting the story with this massive grin on his face. And he's talking about being unfairly detained for 10 days, during which time he was mistreated, he wasn't fed enough, he was threatened, there was a fellow detainee being beaten up. And he's got this massive smile on his face. And frankly, this is showing, at least in one instance, a Jehovah's Witness loving the fact that he was persecuted. But when you look at the details of the story, at least as he's told it, this isn't a case of Jehovah's Witnesses being singled out because, again, the people who were in the basement weren't all Jehovah's Witnesses. This is random police or army brutality against civilians. It doesn't tell us anything. So yet again, we have a clear example of my words, which are perfectly reasonable and perfectly defensible, just being denuded of context, so that I'm made to say something I haven't said. Interesting how they skip out the bit where I say about loving persecution. It isn't quite as simple as that. So they get rid of all of the nuance, all of the occasions on which I make my position as clear as I can and explain that, okay, when I say they love persecution, I can understand that being controversial, and I'm sure most witnesses would recoil at the thought that they love persecution. But my point is, I think, fairly made, that you have here this chap. Admittedly, this is just a reenactment, although it's actually this guy who is reenacting his own persecution. Massive smile on his face. And as I was watching, just during filming, as I was watching this over again, it reminded me of the verse in Matthew chapter 5. Matthew 5, verses 10 and 11. Happy are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, since the kingdom of the heavens belongs to them. Happy are you when people reproach you and persecute you and lyingly say every sort of wicked thing against you for my sake. Rejoice and be overjoyed, since your reward is great in the heavens, for in that way they persecuted the prophets prior to you. I've remembered that verse, not just because I have an encyclopedic knowledge of the Bible. I really don't. I've remembered it because that verse was read to us to convey this idea that when we're being persecuted, we should be joyful. We should rejoice in persecution if it ever comes to that, because we're having our faith validated. We're having confirmation that we are following in the footsteps of Jesus. That's what I mean when I say Jehovah's Witnesses love persecution. I even now have a scripture I can point to in support of what I'm saying, and it's a fair point. Nobody likes to be tortured. Nobody likes to be unfairly incarcerated. But when it comes to being unfairly incarcerated for righteousness' sake, because you've been worshipping God in some way, then it all takes on a whole new dimension in the mind of a Jehovah's Witness. But again, they skip out all of this nuance and all of the material in the footage that gives my words context. Interestingly, they even directly misquote, as in write my words in a way that I didn't say them. For this example, you may have seen, they quote me as saying, "So what we have here is yet more persecution porn, full stop," or period, as you Americans say. This shows perfectly how Watchtower leaps on persecution and craves it. Those were not my words. So I didn't say those two sentences back to back. There was actually a 28-second interval, half a minute of speech between me saying that first sentence and saying that second sentence, in which it gives the whole thing context. And what I'm saying makes so much more sense than if they just clip out that speech in between. That's directly misleading iicsa. There's no other way to put it. Because they didn't even use the ellipses. They didn't even go ... They knew that if they quoted me properly, it wouldn't be as damning. So they literally put words in my mouth, as they've done before if you watch previous episodes in the series. They literally put words in my mouth by changing the way that I'd said something. They misled iicsa. They lied to an inquiry that's been set up to better understand the handling of child sex abuse among not just Jehovah's Witnesses, but all institutions. But in the case of this investigation, Jehovah's Witnesses. How do you explain that if you're a Jehovah's Witness? Not just, obviously, here, where they've not quoted me properly, but in places where whoever's compiled this has sat through me saying things that make it absolutely clear that I am against the mistreatment and persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. Like here, where I say, "I've obviously spoken at length on my channel about how opposed I am to persecuting Jehovah's Witnesses and to governmental bans against Jehovah's Witnesses. I've obviously spoken before on my channel." They clip that bit out. They sit through me saying that and think, "Oh, best not use this." And then again, apart from that kind of behavior being cruel and abhorrent and in violation of people's right to believe what they want, I've described the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses as cruel and abhorrent. But again, that doesn't suit Watchtower. They're desperate to frame me as a hate speech enthusiast. And when it comes to cults, the ends justifies the means. But we move on to our next example.
In 1958, at the age of 21, Brother Winter was sent to a Siberian labor camp simply for practicing his faith in Jehovah. In total, he spent 13 years in multiple Soviet prison camps and 5 years in exile. Despite the persecution, he maintained his Christian qualities.
I was taken to Mordovia. This was the first camp where all believers were put, amongst them 360 of Jehovah's Witnesses. The detentions were very strict, because around this time the government and party politics changed. They decided that prisoners must suffer hunger. The food rations were cut. This was very difficult, I must say. And the winters can be cold. Even in March, it could get as cold as 35 degrees Celsius, minus 35. Altogether, during that time, I was in 7 prison camps. I spent about 13 years there, and another 5 years in exile in Siberia. But when I was convicted the last time, the head of the interrogation department came into my cell and said, "Victor, when you finish all your prison terms, you will have nothing at all. No family, no children." I smiled at him and asked, "How do you know this, Citizen Lieutenant Colonel?" "I don't know it either, but I do trust in Jehovah." Today, I do have a family, and do have my wife, my children. We continue to serve Jehovah. And my greatest joy is when my 6-year-old granddaughter stands next to me in the Kingdom Hall and sings songs that praise Jehovah.
Today, Brother Winter is over 80 years old. What a blessing, as you can see, that he is now surrounded by a big family.
So this is the opening segment of the November broadcast, and there's already so much to talk about. Again, you have this obsession with raking over stories from yesteryear that relate to persecution, or as I've started calling it, persecution porn, to remind witnesses that the organization is being oppressed by Satan's wicked system of things, and therefore it must be God's one true organization, because if there was no persecution, then it wouldn't be fulfilling various prophecies. The organization really seems to delight in any evidence that they can scramble together of anything that can be portrayed as persecution. And, you know, let's be honest, this was persecution. This man was apparently, along with many other Russians, singled out for his religious convictions because he was living in a totalitarian, under a totalitarian regime where only certain forms of religion were tolerated, which seems to be the case again today in Russia. But clearly not all countries are like this. And clearly, rather than this being a case of satanic persecution, this was one country, or one of a number of countries, shall we say, to be more accurate, that had a brutish leadership that oppressed religious minorities. And Jehovah's Witnesses are by no means the only religious minority in history that has suffered persecution. There are many, many examples, even in the modern day, of people being picked on and oppressed and bullied and even killed for having the wrong religion. But what's also interesting is the part about Victor's family, because it homes in on this story of him being told that he'll never grow old and have a big family around him, and then they make the point, but that's exactly what happened. He's now in his 80s and look at his big family. And there's just this crushing irony that Watchtower misses entirely over and over again, that they themselves have become oppressive. They themselves are a regime that punishes people for their religious convictions, for their conscientious stand, as in the case of apostates like myself. We're not just shunned, we're also stigmatized as mentally diseased. Our families are told that they aren't to even email, they're not to even pick up the phone. If there is one organization in my life that goes around telling people they don't get to have their family in one piece, it's definitely the Watchtower organization. And it's kind of insulting that they don't see the irony there. But it's also sad to see Victor continuing the cycle by indoctrinating the next generation. And you see there the footage of him singing with one of his granddaughters. And again, it's just tragic, isn't it, to see that this is just going to go on and on and on. And probably 50 years from now, because this is talking about events that happened about half a century ago, and probably in another half a century's time, if there is anything left of Watchtower still making videos, you can fully imagine Victor's granddaughter being featured, being persecuted in some way by today's Russian regime. So the cycle just never ends. Bear in mind, there will have been Bethelites sitting through all of this material that I'm showing you, looking for something, desperate to find something that they can use to paint me in an incriminating light. And they've sat through this reasoning here where I highlight the irony of an organization that routinely violates people's rights to religious freedom, complaining about believing members being persecuted and having their religious freedoms violated. They sat through all of this reasoning, apparently able to look the other way and just continue their search for something incriminating. But did I not say, bear in mind the heading for this document, or this part of the document, is minimizing other gross acts of state persecution, minimizing it, as in pretending that it's somehow not persecution. And you have me saying there, let's be honest, this was persecution. And I also describe the Russian regime responsible for this man's persecution, historic persecution, as a brutish leadership that oppressed religious minorities. A brutish leadership that oppressed religious minorities. And somehow that's minimizing persecution. Anyway, there's a footnote for this particular example of me being hateful. The footnote reads, "It is grossly offensive to describe as persecution porn." Yeah, they really don't like that, do they? They really don't like me using that phrase. The fact that Jehovah's Witnesses honor and remember victims of persecution, including those who spent decades of their lives imprisoned and maltreated by Soviet authorities, as in R versus Shepherd and another. This is tantamount to suggesting that Jehovah's Witnesses invent or exaggerate stories of the commission of atrocities against them, although that persecution is universally accepted as a historical fact. Again, in the example they've given, I literally say, let's be honest, this was persecution. And I also describe the leadership responsible for this persecution as brutish. So how does any of that apply to me, CCJW, in the clip that you've given? And I mentioned earlier about this excuse they make. We have the right to honor and remember victims of persecution. Yes, you do have that right. And yes, you should honor and remember victims of persecution. But is that the reason why you're showing these stories? Is that really the reason? Or might it be more about the fact that you're exploiting these stories, using them as emotional leverage to frighten Jehovah's Witnesses into thinking the world's out to get them and convince them that they are unique? They are God's one and only true organization. Again, where is the wider outcry against societal intolerance towards religious minorities? Where is the clamor for government action against such intolerance? Where is the call to arms for people to write to their elected representatives and end all religious persecution, not just involving Jehovah's Witnesses? Where are the examples of other religious groups being persecuted? It's only ever Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm sorry, I don't buy that excuse. And before I completely lose it on camera, let's move to the next example.
we met a group of brothers who still cherish the friendships they developed while imprisoned, although it's been about 40 years since their release.
When I was 21 years old, I was sent to prison in the Nonsan Military Training Center because I refused to serve in the military. The soldier working in the military prison came and started to beat me, and he beat me relentlessly. It was late December 1975. 4 of the brothers were put into standing solitary confinement cells called dokgochang. It literally feels like you're in a coffin. The outside temperature dropped to minus 13 degrees Celsius, and cold air seeped out from the wet walls. The brothers couldn't lay down to sleep, so they had to crouch, and I could hear them groaning all night. I extended my hand through the iron bars to the brother in the cell next to mine, and he did the same. We held hands and encouraged each other to stay strong.
So this month, it's a double dose of persecution porn, a persecution porn extravaganza, if you will. We're now hearing the story of Jehovah's Witnesses who were imprisoned in Korea for being conscientious objectors. And don't get me wrong, I'm appalled at the treatment that these men faced. I think it's abominable. I don't think any country should treat people in that way for taking a conscientious stand due to their beliefs. I absolutely condemn that kind of treatment. If there's anything I could have done to stop it, I would have done that, because quite apart from anything else, these men, in my opinion, were already victims of a cult that had manipulated them into giving their lives in service to the leaders. And as though that's not bad enough, then they have their own government turning on them and failing to show them some kind of sympathy and failing to extend basic rights and going above and beyond in their brutish treatment of these men. So I absolutely condemn that. But there's another side to this story, and quite frankly, I find the timing of this quite extraordinary, bearing in mind that these broadcasting episodes, they're put together months in advance. I would say at least 6 months ago, this episode would have been roughly in its present state, because they have to make the broadcasting episodes available to all of the translation teams. So it's available for about 6 months before it's broadcast. So this has been available since early summer, I would suggest. But even so, the timing is just atrocious, because it was at the beginning of this month, it was at the beginning of November, that there was an article in the New York Times: in landmark ruling, South Korea's top court acquits conscientious objector. Basically, the Korean government is realizing that they've got it wrong, that they cannot simply punish members of a group who take this stand. They need to find a way of dealing with their issues of defending the country, because obviously North Korea is just over the border. They do have a need for a military. They do have a need, you could argue, for conscription, but they need to manage that need in a way that doesn't trample people's rights of religious belief. They clearly haven't got the balance right up to now, when the tide is starting to turn and the Korean government's realizing, oh, actually we're wrong in doing this and we're going to start making things right. Watchtower chooses now, albeit again this episode's been months in the works, but it's in the same month that we get a JW Broadcasting episode, using this situation as theatre to manipulate witnesses into feeling like Satan's world is out to get them, manipulate witnesses into thinking they're oppressed and they're being attacked. Watchtower loves this, quite frankly. How can they not love it? How would their theology make any sense if there weren't examples of witnesses being oppressed by governments for their beliefs? They need this. But I want to just briefly talk a little bit about the case in Korea, because there's more to it. There was actually, if you read the New York Times article, it's a little bit misleading because it talks about how there were no other options available. If you're a Jehovah's Witness, you have to fight or you go to prison. That's the feeling you get from reading the article. But there was actually an article in the Korea Herald. It says in this Korea Herald article, once enlisted, conscripts can be assigned to alternative services, such as working at community centres as support staff. But a month of combat training is still mandatory for all, which is the reason for the conscientious objection. Quite simply, Watchtower has been willing to see hundreds of men go for, I think, up to 2 years in jail simply because they don't want Jehovah's Witnesses doing anything that even mimics going to war. They take seriously the scripture in Isaiah that says they shall not learn war anymore. And they say, well, therefore, you can't even do the basic training. You can't even learn how to assemble and clean a weapon. You can't crawl through mud on these assault courses because that means you're learning how to do war. Just through sheer stubbornness, they are willing to see generations. I mean, in this video, we're seeing men in the 1970s. Think of all the men, not just in Korea, but in other countries as well, who've languished in jail cells as Jehovah's Witnesses simply because of Watchtower's obsessive approach to this issue. That's the side of the story that you're simply not going to hear in these JW Broadcasting propaganda pieces. Remarkable, isn't it? How they've again completely shorn my words of context to suit their narrative. But isn't that extraordinary? I've made a perfectly coherent, logical argument, even backed up what I'm saying with material from the Korea Herald, showing that the issue is not so much about fighting, the issue is not so much about bloodshed, about the risk of young Jehovah's Witness men in Korea being put in a situation where they need to kill someone potentially. This is all about the basic training, the combat training. Watchtower doesn't want Jehovah's Witnesses touching a rifle, cleaning a rifle, scrambling through mud on an assault course, training to be a soldier. They're that fanatical when it comes to the verse about not even learning war anymore, that they were happy, and I say were because it seems that there's been a U-turn on this by the Korean government, which I welcomed, and I'll return to that. But they're that fanatical that they're willing to have their young followers sit in jail cells for up to 2 years, 2 years of their lives that they'll never get back, all over this issue of combat training. I showed the citation to prove that I wasn't just speaking off the top of my head, and they miss all of that out. They miss where I say, don't get me wrong, I'm appalled at the treatment that these men faced. I think it was abominable. I don't think any country should treat people in that way. Yeah, that doesn't really help make your argument, does it, CCJW? Best leave that bit out. I absolutely condemn that kind of treatment If there's anything I could have done to stop it, I would have done that. You'll remember I said the same thing in the Russian torture video. If I were there, if it were in my power to stop this happening, I would do it. And I was being sincere. I really would. I take human rights so seriously that I'll defend anyone's right to think what they think. So long as no one else gets harmed, it's your right to have your own ideas. And no government has any authority to tell people what they should or shouldn't believe. I've always felt strongly about that, and that's what's prompted me to take these positions about the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses that have, I don't mind saying, put me at odds with large segments of the ex-Jehovah's Witness community. There have been multiple videos made, I don't mind saying, lambasting me for taking this position, for saying it's wrong to persecute people based on what they believe. And yet CCJW wants to frame me as minimizing persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. I criticize here the Korean government for failing to extend basic rights and going above and beyond in their brutish treatment of these men. So I absolutely condemn that. Could I have been any clearer? Could I have made it any more transparent that I am opposed to the mistreatment and persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses? Let's see what they say in their footnote, because there's a footnote for this. This hate speech minimizes the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in Korea, which resulted in thousands being imprisoned for up to 2 years for their refusal to join the army because of their sincerely held religious conscience. This hate speech minimizes the persecution. I literally said I absolutely condemn that kind of treatment. If there's anything I could have done to stop it, I would have done that. I was minimizing, apparently, the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. The right to conscientious objection to military service is a universally recognized human right, repeatedly affirmed by the European Court of Human Rights, by the United Nations Human Rights Committee, by the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, and which has now been recognized by the Constitutional Court of Korea and the Supreme Court of Korea, which I was actually talking about in the video, but they skipped all that out, didn't they? Just astonishing. There's nuance here, and they don't want to draw attention to any of the nuance, to any of the context. I was literally talking about that decision and praising it as the right decision. I was just pointing out that this wasn't purely about military service. This wasn't purely about conscientious objection in its purest sense, namely, I don't want to be in a situation where I need to kill another human being. That's conscientious objection. This was going above and beyond to a fanatical degree where the Jehovah's Witness leadership was saying, we don't want our young believers, our young followers, even doing the basic training. And I gave the citation. It's just going to make me annoyed if I think about this anymore. So let's go to our final example.
Look closely at the rest of John chapter 18, verse 36. If my kingdom were part of this world, my attendants would have fought that I should not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from this source. So as Christians, what is our position where political matters are concerned? We are neutral.
But also hypocritical is the whole notion of Jehovah's Witnesses being interested in Christian neutrality, especially when you look at how arbitrary their approach has been to Christian neutrality. I've already done a video recently on the Mexico-Malawi scandal. If you haven't watched that before, please do watch it, because it shows how, while in one country, Watchtower was quite happy to see Jehovah's Witnesses being beaten and even raped over the issue of Christian neutrality, in another country, you could argue closer to home, in Mexico, they were quite happy for Jehovah's Witnesses to completely ignore Christian neutrality by bribing officials into providing them with cartilla cards. This is for young men in Mexico that declared these men to be part of the military. These documents flew in the face of everything that Jehovah's Witnesses believe about Christian neutrality. They literally placed young Jehovah's Witness men in the reserve army. But that was deemed acceptable because it was a means to an end. While at the same time you have men and women in Malawi being beaten and raped because they're not allowed by Watchtower to buy a party card that describes them as members of a political party in a single party dictatorship. Actually, it's quite interesting for me to watch this back to back with what we were just discussing about South Korea and the fanatical position taken by Jehovah's Witnesses, whereby these young men were put through 2 years of prison over the issue of basic training. Oh, we don't want you holding a weapon or pretending in any way to know how to use it. And looking at the Mexico-Malawi scandal again from that perspective, where you had a situation where Jehovah's Witnesses were allowed to effectively sign up for the Mexican Reserve Army. On the one hand, young witnesses in South Korea, they can go to jail for 2 years over this issue. On the other hand, in Mexico, you have Jehovah's Witness men bribing officials for a cartilla card. All of this is in the video that I refer to in this clip, which I'll come to. Bribing officials for a cartilla card that placed them in that country's reserves. No need for them to worry about taking a stand. No need for these Mexican witnesses to think about Christian neutrality. On the other hand, different country, almost identical situation. Oh yes, we'll let young Jehovah's Witnesses languish in jail cells for up to 2 years. Maybe I wasn't accurate when I said Watchtower was quite happy. Maybe I was imprecise in saying that. But I think we can all understand what the meaning was. I didn't mean they were literally happy to see Jehovah's Witnesses being beaten and even raped over the issue of Christian neutrality, but they certainly weren't doing anything about it, were they? When I say they were quite happy to see it, that means they were indifferent. They were doing nothing about it. They weren't taking action. That was clearly the meaning in the context of what I'm saying. And also, when it comes to context, did you notice the trick they pulled of misquoting me again? They begin the quote, capital letter W, while in one country, Watchtower was quite happy. They missed the other part of the sentence where I've said, all of this is explained in this video, the Mexico-Malawi scandal, betrayal, I think was the title of the video. Watch that video and all of this will make sense. It doesn't work for the legal department's attempts at framing me as a hate speech enthusiast if they actually show that what I'm saying is coherent and logical and defensible and pointing to another resource that sheds light on everything and makes sense of what I'm saying. So they get rid of it. That's the level of deception. You know, I always prepare these videos thinking, You know, all I have to do is present the information. It'll be fine. People can reach their own conclusions, which hopefully you have done. You know, all I need to do is just show what they've done and, you know, job done. But I'm going to be honest with you viewers, it's hard to make these videos. I don't enjoy making them. I committed to making 7. There's 2 more, because there's 2 more pages. And I hate doing them because it's one thing for me to see the words on the page and just know that that's not how I feel, and know that if I look at the footage, it will all become clear. And know it because I know how I feel, and I know how passionately I'm against the persecution of any religious minority. It's another thing when I'm preparing these videos to actually find the footage and watch the things that Watchtower watched, watch the things that the Bethelites watched, and see the depths of their deceit, see the depths of their evil, that they could sit through all of that material that contextualizes everything, that makes sense of what I'm saying, that even flouts the entire concept of me being in favor of the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses or minimizing the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm imagining when I'm preparing these videos, these cretins, I'm sorry, these cretins doing this and trying to do this to me, going to these levels, going to these depths to sabotage a legal process aimed at keeping children safe. That's how evil these men are. That's what we're up against. This is the extent to which Jehovah's organization is willing to lie in order to get its way. But that, thankfully, is that. That's all I have to share with you. There are 2 more episodes coming up because there's a page on sweeping statements accusing Jehovah's Witnesses of serious crimes. I don't mind telling you that the very first example on the sheet is not even me. And then finally, there's a page, profane and offensive statements about God, Jesus, and the Bible, where they effectively attempt to leverage any perceived anti-atheist bias that iicsa might have against me. That's the best way of describing it. So all of that to come in parts 6 and 7. This has been part 5. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to the Lloyd Evans channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.